Margaret Schultz was packing the last of her belongings when Ernst and Wilhelm came to make sure she was really leaving. "The wagon will be here tomorrow," Ernst said, standing in the doorway of the half-built sadi with his arms crossed and his heavy brows drawn together. "The driver will take you to Yankton. From there you can find passage back to Germany, back to your family, back to wherever it is that widows go when they have no place in America. This is my place in America. Friedrich filed the claim. The land is in his name. Friedrich is dead. The land passes to his family, and we are his family. You are nothing." Wilhelm stepped forward, close enough that Margaret could smell the schnapps on his breath and see the satisfaction in his eyes. "You have no money, no help, no way to prove up the claim. The law requires a dwelling, cultivation, 5 years of residence. You have none of those things and no way to get them. I have the sadi. You have half a sadi, 4 walls and no roof, and winter coming in 6 weeks. Ernst laughed, a harsh sound that bounced off the dirt walls. "You will freeze in that thing. Better to leave now while you still can than to die here like Friedrich died, sick and alone and far from anyone who cared about him." Margaret felt the words like a blow, but she didn't let it show. She had learned in the 3 years of her marriage that showing weakness to the Schultz brothers only made them push harder. They had resented Friedrich for leaving Germany, for claiming land in America, for escaping the family farm where Ernst and Wilhelm were trapped under their father's thumb. When Friedrich died, they had seen their chance to take his land, to erase his American dream, to prove that he had been wrong to leave. "I'm not going back to Germany," she said. "I'm not going anywhere. Then you'll die here, and when you do, the land reverts to Friedrich's family, to us." Ernst smiled, showing teeth that were too small for his face. "Either way, we get what we want. The only question is whether you want to freeze to death first." They left her standing in the doorway of the half-built sadi, watching them walk back to their own homestead a mile to the east, their laughter carrying across the autumn grass like the sound of crows fighting over carrion. She had 6 weeks before the snow came. 6 weeks to build a dwelling, to prove that she could survive, to show the Schultz brothers and everyone else that Margaret Schultz was not going back to Germany, not going to die, not going to give up the land her husband had died trying to claim. She found Grandmother Crow Feather 3 days later at the creek that ran along the southern boundary of her claim. The old woman was gathering plants, filling a leather pouch with roots and leaves that Margaret didn't recognize, moving with the slow deliberation of someone who had been doing the same thing for 70 years. "You are the German woman," Crowfeather said without looking up. Her English was accented but clear, learned from missionaries and traders over decades of contact with the white world. "The one whose husband died, the one the brothers want to destroy. Word travels fast, in small places always." The old woman finally looked at her, dark eyes taking in the faded mourning dress, the repaired boots, the face that was trying hard not to show fear. "You have a plan? I need to build a dwelling, something that will survive the winter, but I have no lumber, no money, no help." "Lumber." Crowfeather made a sound that might have been a laugh. "The whites always think they need lumber. They cut down trees that took 100 years to grow, drag them across the prairie, stack them into boxes that the wind tears apart." She shook her head, her silver-streaked braids swaying. "My people lived on this land for 1,000 years without cutting a single tree. We knew something the whites have forgotten." "What's that?" The earth is warm, the wind is cold. If you want to live, you go where the earth is, and away from where the wind is. Crowfeather pointed toward the low hills that rose along the northern edge of Margaret's claim. You have a south-facing slope there. Good clay soil, easy to dig. You could build into that hillside and let the earth keep you warm while the wind freezes everyone else. Stay with me, because what Grandmother Crowfeather taught her is the reason the Schultz brothers came crawling to Margaretta's door in February, begging for the warmth she had built while they were busy laughing at her. The hillside faced south, sloping down toward a small meadow where the grass grew thick and green even in late autumn. The soil was dense clay mixed with sand, stable enough to hold its shape when you carved into it, soft enough to dig without breaking your tools. Margaret had no experience with construction, had never built anything larger than a chicken coop, but she had 2 hands and 6 weeks and no other choice. Crowfeather taught her the principles that first day, drawing diagrams in the dirt with a stick, explaining how the earth held its temperature while the air changed with every passing cloud. 4 feet down, the ground stays the same all year. 50 degrees in winter, 50 degrees in summer. It doesn't matter what the sky does. Below the surface, everything is constant. The old woman traced the outline of a dwelling cut into the hillside, showing how the back and sides would be solid earth, how only the front would be exposed to the weather. You dig in, not up. You let the hill be your walls. You let the earth be your blanket. How deep? Deep enough to stand. 6 feet at the center, sloping down to 5 at the edges. The roof will be logs and sod, heavy enough to hold the snow, thick enough to keep the heat inside. Crowfeather looked at her with eyes that had seen too much death to be sentimental about survival. It will be hard work, harder than anything you've done before. But you can do it alone, which is more than you can say for a lumber house. Margaret started digging the next morning, using a shovel she had borrowed from a neighbor who didn't ask questions. She worked from dawn until dark, cutting into the hillside 1 spadeful at a time, piling the dirt beside the excavation where it would later become part of her roof. The clay was heavy, the work was brutal, and by the end of the first day her hands were blistered and her back felt like it had been beaten with a board. She kept digging. The second week was harder than the first. Her hands had blistered, broken, and begun to callus over, but the calluses weren't thick enough yet, and they tore open every afternoon. She wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from her petticoat, kept digging until dark, and started again at dawn. Grandmother Crowfeather came every few days to check her progress, bringing food she had gathered from the prairie, roots and dried meat, and herbs that helped with the pain in Margaret's hands. "You're doing well," the old woman said, examining the excavation that was slowly taking shape. "Better than I expected for someone who has never built anything before. I don't have a choice. If I stop, I die. That's the best reason to keep going." By the end of the first week, she had carved a rectangular pit into the hillside, 10 feet wide, 12 feet deep into the hill, 6 feet tall at the center. The back wall was solid earth, compressed over thousands of years, a barrier that no wind could penetrate and no cold could pass through. The side walls were the same, curving slightly inward, creating a space that felt more like a cave than a room. The front wall was the challenge. She needed something to close off the opening, something strong enough to hold back the weather, but simple enough to build without lumber. Crowfeather showed her how to cut sod blocks from the prairie, thick rectangles of grass and roots and soil that stacked like bricks and locked together as they dried. She built the front wall 3 feet thick, leaving space for a door and a small window that faced south to catch the winter sun. The roof was the hardest part. She cut young cottonwood poles from the creek bottom, dragging them up the hill one at a time, laying them across the opening of the dugout in a lattice that would support the weight of the sod above. Over the poles she laid a mat of willow branches, then a layer of grass, then 2 feet of sod cut from the prairie, grass side up so it would continue to grow and bind together into a solid mass. When she was finished, the dugout looked like nothing, a low mound in the hillside, indistinguishable from the natural contours of the land unless you knew what to look for. The door was a heavy wooden frame covered with buffalo hide, salvaged from an abandoned hunting camp. The window was nothing but a frame covered with greased paper, translucent enough to let in light but solid enough to block the wind. She moved in on October 28th, 1880, 3 days before the first hard frost. The dugout was rough. The walls still wept moisture in places. The floor was packed earth that turned to mud when it rained. The air smelled of soil and grass and something older, something that reminded her of cellars and caves and the deep places of the world. But it was warm. 54 degrees without any fire at all, just from the earth that surrounded her on 3 sides and covered her overhead. With a small fire burning in the pit she had dug near the door, the temperature rose to 62 degrees. She could take off her coat. She could work without her fingers going numb. She could sleep through the night without waking up shivering. Ernst and Wilhelm came to see her failure on a November afternoon, riding their horses across the frozen grass with matching smirks on their heavy faces. They had expected to find her gone, fled to Yankton, fled to Germany, fled anywhere that wasn't the Dakota prairie in winter. Instead, they found a mound of earth with smoke rising from a pipe they could barely see, and no sign of their sister-in-law anywhere. "Margaret!" Ernst called, dismounting and looking around in confusion. "Where are you?" The door opened. A section of the hillside that they had thought was solid ground, and Margaret appeared in the entrance. She was wearing a wool dress and no coat, comfortable despite the November cold. Her wheat-colored hair was coiled at the back of her head, her steel-gray eyes were calm, and she was smiling. "Ernst, Wilhelm, what brings you to my home?" They stared at the doorway, at the smoke rising from the hidden chimney, at the woman who should have been dead or gone, and was instead standing in front of them, looking healthier than she had looked in months. "What is this?" Wilhelm demanded. "Where is your house?" "You're looking at it. I built into the hillside, the way the native people taught me. The earth stays 50 degrees all year round. I don't need to burn much wood. I don't need to fight the wind. I don't need anything from either of you." Margaret stepped back, gesturing into the darkness behind her. "Would you like to see?" They didn't want to see, but they were curious, and curiosity was stronger than pride. They ducked through the low doorway and entered the dugout that Margaret had carved from the Dakota hillside. The warmth was immediate, undeniable. The air inside was comfortable, almost mild, despite the November wind howling outside. Ernst looked at the earthen walls, the sod ceiling supported by cottonwood poles, the small fire burning low in its pit. Wilhelm looked at the bed in the corner, the shelves holding food and supplies, the window letting in pale winter light. "This is not a house," Ernst said finally. "This is a hole in the ground. You're living like an animal. I'm living like someone who wants to survive. And when February comes and your soddies are buried in snow and your wood piles are empty and you're burning furniture to stay alive, I'll still be here at 50 degrees, waiting for spring. Margaret's voice was pleasant, almost friendly. The claim requires a dwelling. This is a dwelling. The land office will accept it. Your scheme to take my land has failed. We'll see about that, Wilhelm growled. We'll see what the land office says when we tell them you're living in a cave. Tell them whatever you want. I'll be here when you're done talking. They left without another word, riding back to their homestead with their matching smirks replaced by matching scowls. Margaret watched them go, then closed her buffalo hide door and went back to the warmth that the earth provided. The winter of 1880 to 1881 was one of the worst in Dakota history. The blizzard started in December and didn't stop until March, piling snow so deep that it buried fences and outbuildings and anything that stood less than 10 feet high. The temperature dropped to 40 below for 2 weeks in January, cold enough to kill livestock in their barns and people in their beds. The wind never stopped, howling across the prairie day and night, finding every crack and gap in every building, stealing heat faster than any stove could replace it. Ernst and Wilhelm burned through their woodpiles by the end of January. They had cut what they thought was enough, 20 cords each, stacked beside their soddies like walls of wealth. But the cold was worse than anything they had planned for, and the wood disappeared faster than they could believe. They burned fence posts. They burned furniture. They burned the lumber they had been saving to build a proper house in the spring. By February, they had nothing left to burn. The walk to Margaret's dugout was less than a mile, but in the blowing snow, it felt like 10. Ernst and Wilhelm stumbled through drifts that reached their chests, holding on to each other to keep from being separated, following the thin column of smoke that rose from the hillside where their sister-in-law had built her home in the earth. They found the door by falling against it, their frozen hands scraping at the buffalo hide until Margaret opened it from inside and light and warmth spilled out into the blizzard. "We need help," Ernst said. His voice was hoarse, his face was white with frostbite, and his pride was gone, frozen out of him by 2 weeks of watching his life's work disappear. "We have no wood, we have no heat. If we go back to our homes, we'll die before morning." Margaret looked at the 2 men who had tried to destroy her, who had laughed at her grief, who had waited for her husband's body to cool before they started scheming to take his land. She looked at their frozen faces, their shaking hands, their eyes that held nothing but fear. "Come in," she said, stepping back from the door. "I have room." They stayed for 3 weeks, the 3 of them living together in the dugout that Ernst had called a hole in the ground. Margaret fed them from her stores. The potatoes she had buried in the cool earth, the dried meat she had hung from the ceiling, the preserved vegetables that had lasted because the constant temperature kept them from spoiling. She warmed them by her fire, which she kept burning low and steady, using less wood in a day than they had been burning in an hour, trying to heat their drafty soddies. The brothers were not easy guests. They complained about the low ceiling, the smell of earth, the darkness that even candles couldn't fully push back. But they didn't complain about the cold, because there was no cold to complain about. The temperature never dropped below 52 degrees. The wind never found them. The blizzards that passed overhead were nothing but muffled sounds, distant and powerless, unable to reach them in their shelter of earth and sod. In the evenings, when the fire burned low and the 3 of them sat in the dim light, Margaret sometimes caught Ernst or Wilhelm looking at the earthen walls with something that might have been respect. They never said anything. They were too proud for that, too German, too much their father's sons to admit that a woman had built something better than they had. But they looked, and they thought, and something changed in them that those 3 weeks underground. The brothers didn't apologize. They didn't acknowledge that they had been wrong, that they had underestimated her, that she had saved their lives when they would have let her die. But they stopped talking about taking her land. They stopped laughing at her dwelling. They stopped treating her like an obstacle to be removed. When the snow finally melted in April, Ernst and Wilhelm went back to their own homesteads and started rebuilding. They rebuilt their soddies with thicker walls. They planned to dig cellars into the hillside, to create earth-sheltered spaces where they could ride out the worst of future winters. They had learned something in those 3 weeks underground, something they would never admit to learning from a woman they had tried to destroy. Margaret proved up her claim in 1885, having met all the requirements of the Homestead Act: 5 years of residence, cultivation of the land, construction of a dwelling. The land office inspector came out to see her dugout, examined the construction, measured the dimensions, and pronounced it a legal dwelling under the law. He told her it was one of the most sensible homes he had seen on the prairie, warm in winter, cool in summer, proof against the winds that tore apart wooden buildings. Grandmother Crow Feather died in the spring of 1883, peacefully, in a dugout she had helped Margaret expand over the previous 2 winters. She was buried on the hillside where she had taught a German widow to live the way her people had always lived, and Margaret marked her grave with a stone that said, "She taught me to build where the earth was warm." Margaret Schultz remarried in 1887, a Norwegian farmer named Anders Lindqvist, who had seen her dugout and wanted to learn how to build one himself. Together, they raised 4 children, all of them born in rooms carved from the earth, all of them growing up knowing that survival wasn't about fighting the elements. It was about understanding them. Ernst died in the winter of 1891, taken by pneumonia that his soddy couldn't keep out. Wilhelm sold his land the following spring and moved back to Germany, unable to face another Dakota winter without his brother. The land they had schemed to take from Margaret was eventually bought by strangers, and the Schultz name disappeared from that part of the territory forever. But Margaret's dugout remained, expanded over the years into a complex of earth-sheltered rooms that housed 3 generations of her family. The hillside that had saved her life became a landmark, a place where neighbors came to learn how to dig in instead of building up, how to let the earth do the work of keeping them warm. The original dugout is gone now, collapsed into the hillside it was carved from, reclaimed by the land that had sheltered it for so long. But the story survived, passed down through Margaret's children and grandchildren, told at family gatherings and community events, remembered by people who never met the woman but understood what she had done. Some stories end with the protagonist forgiving her enemies. This one ends with something warmer. A woman who saved the lives of the men who had tried to destroy her, not because she forgave them, but because she had built something they needed, and she was strong enough to share it. If this story of earth-sheltered survival resonated with you, consider subscribing for more narratives of buried wisdom. What is the hillside in your own life that you could build into? And what would happen if the people who wanted you to fail came begging for your help?